Every day we hear of new rumors and claims that the death of the dollar is upon us. And yes, many times the person making that claim is yours truly. With BRICS recently inviting 6 new nations to join, and South American nations discussing plans for trade without the dollar, it can be a shock to see data that dollar usage is on the rise. So much so that it hit a new record in July. It also may be a shock the dollar's value versus a basket of other major currencies is at the exact same place it was all the way back in the 70s. So how does this all make sense? How do we know what is true here? Well, first we have to discuss this with nuance. What are we talking about here for the dollar? Are we talking about its use in trade or its use as reserves for a nation? Are we talking about short-term risks to the dollar or are we talking about long-term risks to the dollar? These questions will help us understand whether and to what extent King Dollar is at risk of being dethroned by any challenger. If you don't know who I am, my name is Joe Brown. I run Heresy Financial University, where I teach active investors how to get high returns while reducing their risk. And if you're interested in joining, link is in the description below. It's absolutely an important issue that BRICS is attempting to expand. They have officially invited multiple nations to join them. BRICS currently includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and they recently invited Iran, which has the world's second largest gas reserves and 1/4 of the oil reserves in the Middle East. They also officially invited Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Argentina, Egypt, and Ethiopia. Now, the ties between some of these nations, including China and South American nations, has been increasing over the last few decades, and it seems like that's picking up steam recently. In fact, Brazil, who is part of BRICS, recently pitched a plan to Argentina that would use yuan to guarantee export payments in order to help with the nation's cash shortages. Now, it's worth noting that these cash shortages are dollar shortages. And so in order to alleviate this pain, the proposed plan is to use more yuan. So this really has more to do with an underlying issue of dollar strength, not of dollar weakness. And in fact, despite hearing things like this all the time, it has not hampered the dollar's use in global payments at all. In July, the amount of dollar usage for global payments rose to a record, with almost 46% of SWIFT transactions involving the dollar. And just in case you're afraid of an imminent takeover of the dollar being replaced by the Chinese yuan, yuan payments account for about 3% of SWIFT transactions right now. SWIFT is the system used by large global banks for interbank currency deals. For years, euros accounted for a larger and larger percentage of global trade, with dollars taking more of a back seat, but it reached an inflection point in late 2020 when the trend flipped, and that has accelerated recently with euro transactions falling off of a cliff and dollar transactions reaching a record high. Now, if you're anything like me, you're probably thinking at this point, well, that doesn't account for all of the transaction data around the world, and you'd be absolutely right. And in fact, while 3% of SWIFT transactions involved the yuan, 13 years ago, that number was only 0.03%. I've said this many times before, but direction and consistency matter more than current rank. And so the dollar's use in international trade is at no risk short term, despite the fact that the rest of the world makes up a larger percentage of GDP than it used to. The dollar's shares of those global transactions have really not changed for decades. So the dollar's use in global transactions and trade is at zero risk short term, but there's a big risk long term. And the reason why is the next thing that we're going to talk about, which is reserves. A report recently from Eurozone SLJ Asset Management shows the rapid erosion of the dollar as a reserve currency. When you adjust for the price change of the dollar, it has lost 11% of its market share since 2016 and 22% since 2008. And again, this is the dollar's use as a reserve currency. So from an individual standpoint, point, this would be like the difference between my checking account and my savings account. What am I using for my reserves, my savings, and what am I using to spend? Now, ultimately, there is a connection between these two, but they're not necessarily the same thing. I, as an individual, may keep all of my savings in gold or silver or Bitcoin, even if I do all of my spending in dollars. Now, here's the other dirty truth about this. Whenever there is a currency or a type of money that nobody wants, for instance, when you are studying episodes of hyperinflation in different countries throughout history, like in Lebanon right now, Argentina, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, the Weimar Republic in Germany, every single time you see a collapse of the currency, at the same time, you see people using that currency way more because they're trying to get rid of it. Now, I'm not saying that's what's happening with the dollar around the world right now, but what I am saying is just because you see an increase in the usage of a currency does not necessarily mean it is cementing its place as a strong currency for the future. It could be an indication of the exact opposite. One of the most important pieces of data that I think many people should be watching for the coming years and potentially decades is the major foreign holders of treasury securities. Treasuries are United States government debt, which is essentially just a dollar that pays interest. It is the bedrock of the global financial system, and it is what slowly replaced gold as the bedrock of the global financial system ever since Bretton Woods, and then the transition away from that when the United States left the gold standard in 1971. At the beginning of 2022, the grand total of foreign treasury holdings was $7.6 trillion. And by the end of 2022, that number had dropped to $7.4 trillion. Now, that change may seem like a drop in the bucket and insignificant, except for the fact that this is a divergence from the trend for many decades, because all central banks around the world for many decades had continued to increase the amount that they were loaning to the US government, increase the number of treasuries they were holding. That trend is no longer increasing. We're doing the opposite now, and on net, the rest of the world is liquidating these. However slowly, what matters more is direction and consistency, not current rank. Especially considering the largest holders of treasuries, Japan and China, are the ones that account for the most of the drop, with Japan going from 1.3 trillion down to 1.1 trillion, and then China going from 1 trillion down to 859 billion. The erosion of treasuries being held as a reserve asset directly leads to the erosion of the US dollar being held as the reserve currency. And eventually that bleeds through to the dollar being used for trade as well. That is a long-term threat, but not a short-term threat. And the main reason why this is going to stick around longer than most people think is because of dollar debt that other people have. Right now, the rest of the world has $65 trillion in dollar debt. By the way, guys, I'm doing a silver giveaway, hundreds of dollars worth of silver for the Silver Symposium in Vegas from September 29th through October 1st. First place prize is getting this 10-ounce silver round. It's an Australian kookaburra, beautiful 10-ounce piece here. Second place gets this 10-ounce bar, not as pretty, but it's still 10 ounces of silver, so hundreds of dollars here. Third place prize gets this 1-ounce silver round. It's plated with gold, and it has this nice little Bitcoin design stamped into it, so pretty cool. So what do you have to do to get the prizes? Number one, you have to sign up for the event with the ticket link in the description below. Number two, you have to meet me in person. The first person who signed up with my link, who meets me there in Vegas, gets this first place prize. Second person to meet me gets the second place prize. Third person there to meet me gets the third place prize. So get your tickets in the link below. Just a couple of weeks left. Can't wait to see you there and give away these silver prizes. Just to explain very simply what's going on here with this dollar-denominated debt, imagine that I'm in a position where I need to borrow money from you. But let's say I print my own money, and it's the money that my entire household uses. And so I approach you and I say, I would like to borrow money from you, but I'd like to borrow from you the money that I can print. And then in the future, when I have to pay you back, I'll pay you back again with the money that I can print. Now, would you take that deal? Probably not, because you have no guarantee that I'm a responsible issuer of my own currency and that when I pay you back, that it will be worth any amount, let alone the full purchasing power plus interest that I originally borrowed from you. This is exactly the position that most nations are in around the world. They want to borrow money for investing in their infrastructure or paying off corrupt politicians or whatever it may be. But most other players around the world don't want to lend to them in their own currency that they can control, especially if it's a large amount of debt. And so when most nations borrow money, they borrow money denominated in US dollars, a currency that neither the lender nor the borrower controls. This would be like you and me arranging dollar debt or debt in gold or debt in Bitcoin, debt in any currency that you and I don't directly control. This would mean that neither the lender nor the borrower would have any influence over the value of the currency, the terms of the debt, when it matures, what interest rate I'm paying, and so on. And there's about $65 trillion of this dollar debt all around the world. And by some estimates, it's up to $100 trillion. This means that for every one of those dollars that somebody owes, eventually they have to go get a dollar from the global dollar market to pay that debt off. And yes, maybe they borrow other debt in order to pay off that old debt, but as interest rates move higher and higher, this becomes harder and harder to do. So the amount of dollar-denominated debt around the world is a very, very effective tool to solidify the dollar's demand in global markets. And the higher interest rates go, the more demand there is for dollars around the world, because the harder it gets to take on new debt to pay off that old debt. So we have to go get actual dollars to pay that off instead of just new debt. So yes, there are risks to the dollar long term, like BRICS, unilateral trade agreements, dumping of US treasuries, and the decline of the dollar as a reserve currency. Not to mention sanctions on Russia and many other nations wondering, hey, should we get out from underneath the dollar sooner rather than later just so that it can't be weaponized against us? But the reality is the Federal Reserve combating inflation is also combating some of these risks by tightening, reducing dollar supply, increasing interest rates, and making this $65 trillion debt burden much, much heavier. It is putting strong upward pressure on the dollar versus other currencies, as it increases the demand by increasing the scarcity. So that even nations that long-term would want to stop using the dollar are forced to use more of the dollar, at least right now. So for the time being, the dollar will not be dethroned unless we see some massive shift in both monetary and fiscal policy, some other major new wars, or something completely unexpected happening that is not happening right now. None of the current risks are short-term risks to the dollar, globally speaking. Yes, they will play out eventually, but it will probably take much longer than many people, including myself, have expected for a long time. By the way, I've got a new course coming out soon in my membership, Heresy Financial University, on cash management. This course I'm going to teach people what to do to increase their returns on their savings so that you get a real return, beating inflation, while at the same time reducing and in some cases eliminating the risk that most people carry with their cash savings. Risks of like bail-ins, bank failures, defaults, and many other risks that people are unaware of. Just like many nations around the world still have to use the dollar, regular old individuals like you and me still have to as well. So we might as well get as high of a return as possible, which is possible to very decently beat inflation with just your regular cash savings, and at the same time reducing and eliminating some of that risk that people take on without even knowing it by just putting it in a regular bank account. This course is not available yet, but it will be available to all members of Heresy Financial University automatically, and it's coming soon. So if you're not yet a member, sign up with the link in the description below. As always, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.